You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and equipment needs at McAllister.com. And the people on the podcast today know, remember, and love P. McAllister. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You can find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our subject today is remembering Governor Robert Orr. Our guests are Mark Lubbers, Dollyne Sherman, and Bob Grand. And as usual for these podcasts, when we have this sort of subject matter, our co-host today is State House legend Jim Shella. Thank you, everyone, for agreeing to come on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
We've done these podcasts. We've done them on Senator Birch Bayh and Senator Richard Lugar, Governor Joe Kernan, and Mayor Bill Hudnut, Congressman Andy Jacobs. And actually, I was talking to Jim Shella earlier today. We're going to try to put one together on the career of Governor Frank O'Bannon. But today, the spotlight is on Governor Orr. All three of these guests worked for him, and Jim Shella covered him for most of his term. Jim got here in December 1982. Jim, let me turn it over to you, and the podcast is yours.
Well, just for context, let's, for those who may not remember, let's spell out that Bob Orr served two terms from January of 1981 to January of 1989. He succeeded Otis Bowen and preceded Evan Bayh as governor of Indiana. And just for starters, let's, if we could, have each of you explain how you came to the Orr administration and what your role was. Bob Grand, let's go with you first.
Well, I was going to law school part-time. I went to a bar. I was overserved by a guy named Ken Cochran, another guy named John Hammond, and I was offered a job to go in as the administrative assistant. I took that job. At that point, my girlfriend left me because she said, "You're going to politics and not finishing law school." My mother was happy because I was making more money than my father ever made. But I became what today is hard to describe. I took care of driving him. We didn't have state police protection as a lieutenant governor. I did all the advance work. I handled, any number of things that were constituency related, but primarily spent almost 3 years, some of which I was driving, some of which state police were driving, with him in a car, traveling the state of Indiana.
And for those who may not know, Ken Cochran and John Hammond were longtime aides to Bob Orr. Dollyne Pettengill, what brought you to the Orr administration?
Me.
Yeah,
Mark Lubbers did. My name was Pettengill back then, by the way. Well, I was in the State House since 1979, and I watched Bob Orr from a distance and learned from him as he presided over the Indiana Senate for 2 years. I was on the staff of the Indiana Senate. I then went into the administration in 1984, working for NDOT as their Director of Public Affairs and liaison to the governor's office, lieutenant governor's office, and the legislature. So spent a lot of time during that period of time learning about transportation issues, which was one of Bob Orr's priorities throughout his term in office, and then joined the governor's office in late 1986. Mark Lubbers did bring me into the office, and I worked under his tutelage for several months before he left the office.
Okay, Mark, you weren't there at the beginning. I know that you basically came out of the bullpen to try to save things. Tell me about how you got there.
So I had worked for Dick Lugar from early 77 until just after the Republican National Convention in 1980. Then went off to business school and was working in a really perfect job for me in St. Louis. And I got a phone call from Lou Gehrig. And Lou said, hey, you should be press secretary to the governor. And I said, I've never had anything to do with the media. And he said, yeah, but you can do it. So I took advantage of a free trip home to be interviewed by the governor and Jim Neal. For those of you who remember Jim Neal, he was a former Indiana Republican state chairman and owner of the Noblesville Daily Ledger, and a great journalist in his day. And so the two of them sat in the study of the governor's residence and interviewed me. And I didn't know Bob Orr, except by name then, and fell in love with him sort of in that meeting. He was curious as all get out. And it was clear to me that he had something inside that was motivating him to a much larger vision for the state of Indiana. And he was looking for a way to get that done. And they offered me the job. I went back home to St. Louis, and St. Louis is a blue blood town. It's a place where you gotta be born into the place. Completely different from Indianapolis, where I think it was then, still is, I think, a meritocracy. If you wanna play a role, you can. You just have to put your hand up and do work. So we came home and set about working. I guess and realized you had been only on the job 6 months. You were the very first journalist I met.
I didn't know that.
You were. I learned very quickly, it took about 3 weeks of being press secretary to a governor, that there were only 2 rules. One was always tell the truth, and the other one was never be boring. And
you were never boring. You were never boring.
I tried.
And then he hired me.
Well, let me tell you, I don't think it's a secret to any of you folks that prior to your arrival, Bob Orr had some media relations problems. His first press secretary as governor operated in what I thought was very strange fashion. He had an office that was in the main suite of offices next to the governor's big office, and you had to come in and see a receptionist in order to get him to come out and talk to you, and you had to carry on all of your conversations in front of everyone in the governor's waiting area. Not a good way to do business for those who know how this works.
Well, that's stupid.
Yeah. And everything changed when you got there. And essentially the administration was opened up. And I also think it's worth noting, Bob Orr's first term was pretty rough. There was a tax increase in 1982. There were scandals to be dealt with in the state prisons and the mental hospitals. They needed a little bit of a correction to right the ship there before the end of the first term. Is it correct?
Well, it was easy for me to diagnose and analyze what was happening because I had no roots with any of the people involved. Bob and I both sort of came out of the Lugar enterprise and had a little bit different view of the world. He and I were in different times new to state government, but Bob was able to give me some really good advice about what I was getting into. because he lived through the beginning of that period. So I guess in 3 parts, he was succeeding at the time the most popular governor in Indiana history, in Otis Bowen. I've said it enough times in private. I can probably say it in public now. I think Otis Bowen was probably one of the worst governors in Indiana history. He was a colossal do-nothing governor, which fit the temperament, candidly, of the state. People
Well, he was best known for cutting property taxes, but by doing so, he created a lot of other problems.
Well, so he did that in the first year, and then spent the next 7, in my opinion, not doing very much. And in addition to having to follow someone who was so popular, we inherited, or Bob Orr inherited, a lot of those executive leadership positions in parts of state government, and in particular parts where there were problems. And when you follow a very popular governor, it's unpopular to start axing his people. And so he was sort of caught betwixt and between. And then externally, you had this other problem, which we'd had gigantic inflation, which helps government on the way up, because property taxes go up with property values, income taxes go up with incomes. But in mid 1980, Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker, acting independently, decided they were going to squeeze inflation out of the economy, and that caused economic collapse. When I joined the staff in June of 1983, the unemployment rate in the UAW belt, Anderson, Marion, Richmond, was nearly 18%. And so you had state revenues falling off the table. And so Gran can talk about this, or Dollyne can talk about this from her position in the Senate. Bob Orr acted against the advice of Republican leadership in the legislature and called a special session in December of 1982 in honor of Chella's arrival, and raised taxes before the 83 legislative session. So he's got a predecessor who's incredibly popular. He's got scandals emerging in parts of state government, and he's now got an economic crisis on his hands. I mean, it was a full-blown, use a technical term, shitstorm.
and as I said, he had some staff issues. So you know,
you have to layer in the fact too, Mark, that in 1982, the political significance of this is, if the election in 1982 had gone one more week, Dick Lugar would not have been a United States senator. I mean, Every single line in politics going through 1982, starting in the summer all the way through the fall, was a down. I mean, there was nothing you could do. And I think that's the courage of Bob Orr. In the face of all this political upheaval and all of the thing, he said, this is what we need to do, and this is why. And I think when people talk about political environments, that was a toxic environment in 1982, in my opinion. Looking ahead then to 2 years later, you're going to have to run for election.
Yep, you're exactly right.
Well,
he had enormous courage. Remember, this is a guy, and courage and moral rectitude. This is a guy who was 3 months away from graduating from the Harvard Business School when Pearl Harbor is bombed. And a week after Pearl Harbor said, I got to join the Army. I don't have a choice. He never got his degree, which I learned 10 years later.
Well, if I could, just want to add one point to that, because we would probably have a race to who would raise that, because I think that is the greatest thing about his character. The even better part of his character was, I had left in 1982, and in 1984, I think it would have been his 50th or 40th anniversary, and the president of Harvard called. He appointed me as his outside. I was helping him outside. The president of Harvard wanted to give him his degree, actual degree, not an honorary degree. He wanted to give him his degree, and he had me tell the president of Harvard, I forget who it was then, that he would not show up at the reunion if they did that. If they gave him an honorary degree, that's fine, but do not give me the degree because I did not graduate. That's the kind of guy that Bob Orr was.
Well, one of the things that struck me about him was he was the governor of the state, but he insisted that he be driven around in a Chevrolet Impala. And as I understand it, the state police put 3 different engines in that car to keep it going.
I wrecked that car.
Wow.
You don't know this story?
I don't.
So I get a phone call one day when we're doing the Subaru Isuzu deal. And Bob Orr is in Europe on a trade mission. And John Mutz is on the phone and he calls me and he says, I need you to take the Subaru guy to see the plant site. And I said, well, we probably should take one of the state police helicopters and see it from the air. He said, oh, that's a great idea. So I got dressed and I ran out of the house. I called Cochran and said, can you get me a helicopter? Can we see this? And we had Chuck Preston drive up to Lafayette to bring us so we could drive home. Well, Preston didn't want to drive the car home. So I'm driving Star One home. Star One is the license plate number. That's what we call the car. So we get to, we're 10 blocks from the State House at 10th and Senate, and a woman blows a stop sign and T-bones the car, nearly killing the Subaru guy who's sitting in the passenger seat. And wow. So I have no wallet. And a police officer who had just gone off duty saw this accident happen, and he came up and he asked me for my registration. And while I was looking for it, or for my license, while I was looking for it, he ran the plate, which did not say Star One, and it was one of those confidential plates. And so he tries to get the ID of the car and he can't get it. And now he has a person who doesn't have a driver's license and a car that's not in the system. And I said, maybe the registration is in the trunk. And I opened the trunk and there's the Uzi. He said, I think you should come get in the police car.
I had not heard that story.
Yeah, that was a fun day.
Well, I did hear that when Bob Orr left office, he didn't own a car. He needed a car, and he wanted to buy that one, and the state wouldn't sell it to him, correct?
Is that true, Bob?
That's true. That's true.
Well,
so the 2 things about the confidential plate, that came about when he was lieutenant governor, because I got a confidential plate which tacked on with magnets. So when we would be driving and we would be late, I'd be speeding and he'd say, you need to slow down. You know, this car says Star One. I said, the minute we get pulled over and somebody says it's Star One, I'll take responsibility. And it wasn't until he was governor that we went up to Lafayette, Mark's home. We parked to see the president. I parked in a spot because we were running late. We got a ticket, and the ticket was on the confidential plate, not on Star One. And President Hansen was very embarrassed. But then when they gave the governor the copy of the ticket, he insisted on paying it. He says, this isn't my license plate. And I had to tell him that we had this one in the trunk that I would throw on the car when he got in the car, and that way I could speed. So, and I have the Star One license plate. He gave it to me after the end of that year. So I have that actual plate.
You deserve it.
Let's talk a little bit about the '84 election, because after experiencing all that trouble in a first term, Bob Orr runs against then Democrat State Senator Wayne Townsend in what turned out to be a very close race. And
if that race had gone another week, we'd have lost.
Right.
In fact, my understanding is the Orr campaign had negative ads prepared, ready to go, because they felt that they were threatened. That is the last gubernatorial race in Indiana where there were no attack ads on the candidates, and it was closing fast.
Well, there were Townsend negative ads.
Yes, but there were none from Orr that got on the air.
That's true.
There were none in 2012 either, Jim.
Okay, all right, I stand corrected. Anyway, it was an unusual circumstance.
So that was the great license. That license branches were the issue of that campaign.
That's what I was going to say.
And
the license
utility
branches,
regulation. Quip.
for those who don't remember, the license branches were controlled by the party of the governor, and the Republicans had been in control of the license branches for some time. And there had been a series of scandals, including one in Muncie where somebody stole $400,000 from the license branch. So I don't know how much money they were bringing into the Republican Party, but there was $400,000 to be stolen in Delaware County.
Well, it's bringing money into both parties, of course, but more into the party in power.
Right. And so it was significant that for the members of the Republican Party that circumstance continued. Townsend was promising to bring the license branches into state government, and Bob Orr, under a great deal of pressure late in the campaign, announced that he would do that as well if reelected. Correct?
Correct.
And that's probably what saved him.
It saved him, but it created a dilemma because your political organization, if you're the governor, is the Republican county chairman.
Right.
And so the Republican county chairman were not happy that Bob Orr was going to end their little fiefdom. And so while it cut positively with public opinion, it cut negatively with our political organization.
Sure.
And it didn't cut so positively with the public because Senator Townsend was able to continue campaigning on that issue and take credit for the fact that he was the one who got it changed.
Correct.
It was a very dicey election. Yeah, it was not fun.
Let me tell my favorite story from that campaign, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely.
Bob Orr rarely made a personal appearance in that campaign when he did not award a Sagamore of the Wabash, what was known as the highest civilian award in Indiana. So we started recording these presentations, and I didn't get the story done before the election, but in December I did a story. I found the statistics and learned that Bob Orr had given out more Sagamores by far than any previous Indiana governor. We did a story that essentially indicated that he was devaluing the award. And so in January of 1985, I was sworn in as president of the Indianapolis Press Club, and it was his practice to come over and administer the oath to the board and the new president. And it was also his practice to give the outgoing president a Sagamore of the Wabash. He gave both the outgoing president and me a Sagamore on that occasion because he was trying to send the message: if you don't think this is worth anything, what do you think of this? I framed it.
Grand, do you want to bust out Shella? Because in the video portion of this podcast, the Sagamore he has displayed is by a different governor.
That's okay. I mean, he's fortunate to have multiple Sagamores because it's, some people are, bipartisan in their approach to life. Others are not. So that's my favorite, Mark is understated in terms of that campaign because the role that he played, and Ken and John, and it was a very intense campaign, but there was also the beginning of, and we thought Bob Orr would do very well in the debates, but the one most, it was really kind of a weird way that this developed. This was my memory of it, but the governor had asked me and another lawyer to spend, I would think we spent almost 4.5, 5 weeks looking solely at his legislative record, both Bob Orr's for his 4 years in the Senate and Wayne Townsend's years as the House and Senate. And they gave us a list of things to look for in terms of priorities and what they did. And I won't bore you with all of this, but at the end of the research, we had a presentation, and I off the hand made the point that Wayne Townsend had never authored, co-authored, sponsored, or co-sponsored an educational issue. And Bob Orr seized on it. And afterwards, Cochran pulled me aside and he says, I think he's going to use this in the debate. And it was a week away. He said, you have 1 week to verify that that's 100% true. Because if he goes on there and says that, you're dead. Okay. So for the next week of my life, I went right back to every single bill that was in the old library where they stored them and reread every single one to make sure that he could validate that. But he did use that line, and it caused a little bit of a stir because there was a follow-up from the press. Maybe you, Jim, maybe I just remember there was a lot of follow-up to the point where Wayne originally said he didn't think that was correct. He didn't say no. He just said, I don't think it's correct. And it became kind of a real issue in terms of, because education was a big issue. Bob Orr was pushing, as you know, in his first term. So that was my favorite thing about the campaign. But I'll tell you, I sweated for about a week.
My favorite thing about that campaign is that Bob Orr, who was the oldest governor in America, became the first one to do a political music video.
Right.
These were the days of the MTV startup, and Hammond had the great idea that Bob Orr should do a music video to the music of a new Henry Lee Summers song called "Stay With Me," and it was quite something. I'm still shocked to this day that Gordon paid for it.
Gordon being Gordon Durnill, the state GOP chairman,
Right.
who was in charge of the campaign. Gotcha. You mentioned education. I mean, one of the things that Bob Orr did as governor was win passage of the prime time education plan, which reduced class sizes in Indiana. Was that his primary accomplishment?
Well, his primary, that happened in 1986. The bigger education accomplishment was the 87 A+ legislation, which we got about 2/3 of. It was, this is too bad that John Hammond's not on here with us. This was John's baby. It was the most far-reaching education reform package of its day. Close on the heels of what Lamar Alexander had done in Tennessee, but went further than that. It called for an enormous amount of new accountability. The whole idea of doing statewide testing came out of the A+ program in 1987. It was Governor Orr who suggested in that package that we should tie teacher compensation to student performance. And no one's gone near that third rail. Well, Tony Bennett tried to bring back some of that stuff. Most of that A+ accomplishments were eviscerated during the Bayh administration, some by Republican members of the General Assembly, who are very responsive to the most powerful politicians in their districts, and those people are school superintendents. And
teachers. I mean, Bob Orr essentially was at war with the Indiana State Teachers Association.
We were indeed, but for good cause. We never went out looking for enemies. But Bob Orr came to the conclusion that we really needed a significant cultural change in Indiana. That we were a state that had somehow lapsed into a psychology of being good enough, which if you go back in Indiana history to the early part of the 20th century, Indiana was the most happening place there was. It was a vital and ambitious place to live. And somehow I always believe I'd love to go do a PhD project on this, get my doctoral degree. I think it came out of the Ku Klux Klan takeover of the state in the 20s, when we sort of volunteered to dumb ourselves down. And Bob Orr was the one who said, this isn't going to stand. His 1987 State of the State speech, which I think is an incredible statement, could be given today, sadly, without very much change and still be true. Governor Daniels put a big dent in that, and I think he sort of picked up the flag that Bob Orr died on the field of battle with, picked it up and started to re-energize that attempt to, as Governor Daniels would say, aim higher. and he made a lot of progress on that front, but it has to be sustained over a long period of time in order to get the psychology of the state to be different. In that speech in '87, he gave every member of the legislature a book by David Halberstam called The Reckoning. And it was a book about how mediocrity in the automobile industry caused the collapse of the American automobile industry. And he said, look, this is going to be our fate as well if we don't do something radically different. And then he tried to pass the most ambitious education reform package in the country.
Dollyne, we need to bring you in here a little bit. You worked in the Senate. Bob Orr came from the Senate. He served as lieutenant governor, which is president of the Senate. And it seemed to me that as governor, of the governors I've covered, and there have been a few, he looked to the legislature for solutions more than others. Is that fair?
Well, he did, and he looked to the legislature for partnerships. I mean, he was a product of the Senate. He understood the legislative process as well or better than any, and knew how important it was. And it also, the process also helped bring along the public, because the legislative process is such a public process with public hearings and a lot of public engagement with citizens coming to the State House. So he understood that process, and he respected it. And so he did. He had several key allies in both houses. A couple on both sides of the aisle. I'll leave it to Bob and to Mark to correct me there. At least one or two, especially on the education reform package. I mean, there was Democrat Senator Louis Mahern was very helpful and instrumental in getting that through, as well as the Republican allies. So yes, he did. Absolutely.
Mark mentioned the Subaru Isuzu deal. That was the first Japanese-owned auto plant to come to Indiana. Actually, Indiana was near the end of the list in terms of Midwest states to land Japanese auto plants, and there was a lot of criticism of that. But the reality is, Bob Orr did a lot to open up foreign trade in Indiana in ways that continue today.
Yeah, he absolutely did. It was a huge priority. It came out of his own personal experience as a businessman in Evansville. He knew that markets around the world could be opened. It just took effort. And he was convinced that you could build a great deal of economic growth for the people of Indiana if people would just focus on foreign trade. So the Department of Commerce had fantastic people who worked on opening up foreign markets. We had our share, Jim, as you'll recall, of Japanese parts plants. But what we didn't have was an assembly plant, and that was the big kahuna. And so when Mutz and Orr were able to land it, it was a very big deal. If Mike McDaniel were on this podcast, he would probably regret that we ever got that plant, because Evan Bayh used it against John Mutz in the 1988 campaign to great effect.
And the irony of that was that Wayne Townsend used the idea that we did not have an auto plant by circulating in one of his ads a copy of all the Midwestern states around us and circling the plants that they had, and we had a big zero at that point. And that to me was the greatest irony about that whole process. I would just add one thing that people really don't, I want to go back to, and I think Mark and Dollyne, you talk about a guy's character, but Subaru Isuzu, when they came in and we were negotiating, I was an outside lawyer then, but the biggest issue there was to get enough land to be able to, in those days, now it's easy because we have everything. We did not have statutes like we have today, but he had to come up with the land. And he and I and State Treasurer Marge O'Loughlin figured out that the state could ultimately finance something if in fact they came in, and we could give them some credits, but we didn't have any mechanism by which to get the actual dollars. And to tell you the kind of governor that he was, he called me one day and he said, come to the office, which I did. And he said, get in the car. And we drove over to INB and met with Tom Miller as the president of the bank. And he said to the president of the bank, I need this much money in an unsecured loan. I'm going to go to Frank McKinney and I'm going to go to Tanzel or Frenzel, and I'm going to get it from all three banks, but I'm starting with you. And he put that deal together, and we literally had the money unsecured from three big banks in Indianapolis, and we bought that land. And people don't realize, but today this stuff is easier. I mean, and the governors don't do it, and probably was controversial. Some might argue whether it's legal, but those were the things that this guy's vision was. He decided that he was going to get that plant, and he knew he had to offer them something that other people wouldn't, and that's what he offered them. And of course, we built it, we financed it, and it was, all the debt was retired and it was expanded. So it worked. But that's the kind of guy that Bob Orr was in terms of what Mark and Dollyne we've described earlier, is just a guy that was really in his game, a very bright man.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, a law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. We are discussing the life, times, and career of former Hoosier Governor Robert Orr. Our guests are Bob Grand, Mark Lubbers, and Dollyne Sherman, all of whom worked for the governor at some point. Our co-host is Jim Shella. Bob, maybe you can speak to this part. How did Bob Orr get selected to be Otis Bowen's running mate in 1972?
Well, the incredible lesson that was learned, I learned directly from the governor at a particular point in time, and that was when Marge O'Laughlin, who was the clerk of the courts, decided to run for state treasurer. And Bob Orr called me to his office, and he said, "You're going to be Marge O'Loughlin's campaign manager," 1986. And I looked at him and I said, "My son was just born. I'm really having problems. I've got a whatever." And he said, I don't think you heard me. You're going to be Marge O'Loughlin's campaign manager." And I said, I felt like, Ruckelshaus house at getting called to the White House by Nixon. But he said, "I really want you to understand why." He said it was a contested convention, and the county chairman of Marion County, one Keith Bulin, famous guy, wonderful guy, had decided that he was going with John Hart, and he had told the caucus that they were all to vote for John Hart. Now, Marge O'Laughlin would never say a bad word at all, but she did not have a good feeling about John Hart. John Hart had not treated her well in some instance or whatever. So essentially that last ballot, everything in Marion County went for John Hart except for, I think it was 32 votes out of Washington Township, where one Marge O'Laughlin was the Washington Township chairman. And Bob Orr won that, I think, by 20 or 18 or whatever. And his telling me that story, he said, quote unquote, "I'm going to get Marge O'Laughlin elected state treasurer." By the way, Ed Thuma was in that race, and he had been endorsed by Otis Bowen. So this was not going to be like just walk into a convention and whatever. But when he told me that story, and I took Marge O'Laughlin to lunch, I mean, she had the actual numbers. She said, "Yeah." She said, "I really like Bob Orr. He's a really decent man. He was very honest. But you know what? He was always treated me politely." And he said, I really appreciated that. And he said, "I can just tell you that after that vote was cast, and back in those days they could get the machines, Keith Bulin advised me that my political future was over." Which it wasn't, but anyway.
Bob, let me ask you another quick question, because you were with Governor Orr the earliest. Did he talk much about his military career? It was mentioned earlier. He left Harvard. He graduated from Yale, went to Harvard. Interesting, kind of almost a George W. Bush approach or career path. He joined the military without graduating from Harvard, served, eventually attained the rank of major in the Pacific, and was awarded the Legion of Merit, which is a very, very high award commendation from the United States military. Did he talk about the Pacific much and how it shaped his career and his person?
No, he really didn't. And I think you have relatives, I have relatives from World War II, and those people really didn't talk much about the war. And he was one of those. I don't remember a lot of discussion about it. I do remember a lot of discussion when he discussed Josie, the Women Air Corps, what she or her contributions were. But he never really highlighted. We did an ad at one point where he was dressed in a uniform, or we did something. But he was in the lieutenant governor days in all those travels. I don't remember, much, even in the introduction of him. Obviously, it was a reference to his military background, but he did not talk about it. And in all those times I spent time with him, in the conversations, a few, but not very many, I would say.
He did not talk. I agree with Bob. He did not talk about that experience, part of his life, in the office. But when we traveled, I had the opportunity to travel with Bob Orr overseas on 5 different trade missions, both to Japan and to Germany. He actually was in both areas, although he served mostly in the Pacific. And in sort of the teacher mentor that he was to all of us, he talked about his experience, and especially in Japan. I mean, he was many, many times in hundreds of meetings that he sat across the table with business leaders in Japan in particular, and the thought would cross his mind. They were the same generation, the same age, and he would wonder where they were during World War II and whether he faced them in battle. But he had this amazing ability to get past that and move on. And he also talked about he was served during the occupation after the war, and those experiences. And one other story he told us when he was in Germany, in southern Germany, in Munich. He took us all to in one of the rare times we had kind of off away from a business meeting. He took us to the Hofbrauhaus in Munich and talked about that as a gathering place for his fellow soldiers, that they would gather there from time to time and then all leave and be deployed on their various missions and come back. And he talked about the sadness of those who never returned. So it was very much a part of his life and part of his thinking and perspective and his global perspective. And, we talk about his, what he came to the governor's office after a 25-year, very successful military career, and then went into business, was a very successful business leader for 25 years, where he traveled the globe. He brought all that experience and perspective into the State House when he served in all 3 roles there.
Thank you, Dollyne. That's perfect, actually. In 1980, Robert Orr runs for governor, but there's another very popular Hoosier politician that worked about 4 blocks away from him, and that was Bill Hudnut. Was there any sense in 1980 that perhaps Bill Hudnut was going to run for governor?
Well, there was more than a sense. I mean, there were meetings and there were gatherings of folks. There were rumors, so it was not what you would say a 100% real. But in the time I showed up in 1979, when it was really starting the campaigns was identified. We were obviously out doing things for mayors, and campaigns didn't go 4 years back then. They really kind of geared up in early 79, and that's when I was brought on board so John Hammond could go to the campaign. But throughout 79, as Mayor Hudnut was running for re-election, he was conveniently running for re-election and being in a lot of other places and talking about Indianapolis. And he was a fine mayor in that sense. But I think that around January of 1980, I would say that there was a buzz that, again, given all the stuff that Mark alluded to earlier, 82 was not an easy year. 83 was even tougher. And so, I'm sorry, I wasn't talking about that. In 75, 76, 77 with Otis Bowen, he was trying to do a lot of different things, and the economies and things were looking, okay. And then Reagan, of course, comes in after Carter, but you still had a lot of stress there. And so we saw a lot of, talk, but honestly, I never really saw anything that amounted to a campaign.
Dollyne, I'm going to ask you this question because there's nobody better at PR than Dollyne Sherman. You have Jim Shella here on the podcast.
Present company excluded.
You must be talking about Lubbers, who's pretty damn good himself. How did the news media, the State House media, treat Governor Orr, and what was that relationship like?
Well, Bob Orr was very proud of his journalistic roots. I mean, he bragged regularly about working for the Yale Daily News, and therefore he considered himself a former journalist. And so he had a high respect for the role that they played and individual reporters for the most part. He was accessible. I was told basically when Mark brought me on, when Bob Orr leaves the office, you're with him. And that was whether he's traveling around the state or traveling around the world, and I was. And so I had the opportunity to see him interact with reporters all over the state and all over the, when we traveled overseas as well. I think that they had a respectful relationship. But I think Bob Orr was of the generation, and maybe, by today's standards, he would be considered maybe establishment back then, even though he was, from a policy standpoint, way ahead of his time. But they didn't find him exciting. And, you don't really understand, I think, the dynamic. I didn't understand until after he left office and a new governor, and you had the opportunity to compare, how the media covered one Governor Orr versus the next new, young, exciting governor. And so which was fascinating and very interesting. The expectation was that Bob Orr was always accessible, and I know the governor they were a little bit more scheduled about his time with reporters and so on. So, but I got to tell you, I'll tell you one story. A lot of times reporters would go. One in particular, we all remember Bob Ashley would walk in the governor's office and walk straight up to the governor's scheduler and want to talk to Bob Orr, and Bob Orr always had his door open. And so my office was in the hallway, and where the glass doors are there, and I heard this booming voice, yelling, if you want to talk to me, you go down the hall and talk to Dollyne, and she'll arrange it for you, which is probably one of the rare times when he really, wasn't willing at the moment, to talk to a reporter, because we'd walk out when he left the building. He would allow me to bring reporters to him that had questions on his way out the door, to getting in his car, to, whenever he had a minute, he was available and accessible. So, and he insisted that the door be open, and he insisted that the press boxes be at the other end of that hallway. So when reporters came into the office, Mark remodeled the office and was very much part of this, so they could stand there and see that his door was open and he was working. And it was very important to him, transparency and accessibility.
Let me just endorse all of that. He was incredibly available. There was an old radio reporter named Bob Rutherford who figured out what time the governor generally showed up for work, and he would meet him at the north door and walk to the office with him and conduct an interview on the way. And so virtually every morning, Bob Rutherford would have an interview with the governor about whatever the subject of the day was. Bob got to work earlier than the rest of us. Most of us weren't at work yet at that point. But secondly, he was not good at messaging. It was tough for us to pick a soundbite out of what he had to say unless he got angry. I always enjoyed days when Governor Orr got angry, because he became much more succinct.
Mark, would you like to weigh in, Mr. Lubbers?
I don't think Bob Orr was particularly accessible in the first couple of years. Jim, you weren't there for much of that, but I know from talking to members of the press corps, they found the opening of the office, which I did and made an intentional effort to do, refreshing. My view was that Bob Orr was a very smart guy. Jim was masterfully diplomatic. He was horrible with electronic media. Dollyne is exactly right. He fancied himself a journalist, but a print journalist of a former era. My view was we had a lot of smart people in the news media, Shella included, and they could figure out how to find the soundbite. And it wasn't always easy, but it was there. And I never worried that he was going to misspeak because he was a very smart guy. He just wasn't very polished when it came to dealing with electronic media. Now, I got to say something else here, and that is that, you know, politicians today complain about the news media in the State House. We had lions of journalism in the State House in those days. I mean, the place was jam-packed with some of the very best journalists the state had ever seen. And there were 2 times as many of them. And so it was a gauntlet of people. You had, I don't want to sound like I'm aggrandizing Shella, but I mean, he is and was the dean of the State House Press Corps and survived and had dozens and dozens and dozens of news breaking stories in his career. A damn good journalist. You had the likes that sitting on that AP desk, Jan Carroll. There was never anybody smarter than Jan Carroll about ferreting out a story. Ed Zigner was still around until I got him fired. And the place was just chock full of people who could take you down if you were not careful. And I never worried about Bob Orr making a mistake because he was smart and he was honest. It got to be a popular expression in the Reagan days, let Reagan be Reagan. I felt the same way about Bob Orr. Let Bob Orr be Bob Orr. He wasn't ever going to be great with a soundbite, but you always knew he was going to be honest. And I think over time, that carried the day. When we redesigned the office in 1986, I made sure that those press boxes sat where everyone in the news media, Bob Orr used to sit in that corner, Bob, remember where those that little couch and that chair setting was, and he conducted almost every meeting there in that little corner. And I made sure that those press boxes were put right there so that as the members of the media took stuff out of the press boxes, they could look down that long hallway and make eye contact with the governor. And that door was almost always open. And that was the first thing that got changed in the Biden administration.
Excuse me, Mark, sorry, about John Mutz. Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about how John Mutz became Bob Orr's running mate? And then Dollyne, would you like to talk a little bit about how Governor Orr felt when Mutz lost the 1988 election to Evan Bayh? Bob?
Well, just a very simple. Mark was part of a conversation that we were the other day where we had Gordon Durnell, John Hammond, Mike McDaniel, and Mark and myself. And I mean, it's a real simple equation. Mike McDaniel ran an incredible campaign. And in that convention, it was very contested. Back to the theory about things were starting to not be good in the county chairman ranks. There was all kinds of conversations about their power in a convention, so forth and so on. And yet we gone to a direct primary for the first time. And Mike McDaniel ran a campaign which ended up the last week with a postcard that looked like Bob Orr was endorsing John Mutz. That's not the only thing, but I think that was key. And Bob Orr had a very healthy respect for John Mutz. They both had similar backgrounds, similar roles in the Senate. But that was when we were talking about that the other day, Mark, that was kind of my thought. I mean, Mike really gets a lot of credit for running one heck of a campaign.
Couldn't agree more.
Dollyne, talk a little bit, please, about how Governor Orr reacted to the 88 Democrat takeover.
Well, I would say this. First of all, John Mutz, I was John Mutz's intern in the Senate. I worked for him, so he was a very special man to me personally and professionally. And worked in that campaign in '80 for his election as lieutenant governor. John Metz was a true 100% partner to Bob Orr. He contributed to the success of everything that Bob Orr accomplished. It was a true partnership, and Bob Orr felt that and acknowledged that every day, every opportunity that he could. If you read his State of the State addresses, you'll see it there. But he was probably the most impactful lieutenant governor. He was very much like like Bob Orr in his background and so on. So when and I want Mark to weigh in on this as well. So he was deeply disappointed personally and for the state of Indiana when John Metz lost that election. And for the state of Indiana, he was very concerned about the many accomplishments being overturned. And he forewarned that, by the way, in his farewell address to the legislature in early 1989. And some of that absolutely came to pass. So he was disappointed personally for John Metz because he truly thought he was the most qualified and that he was the one to take the mantle and then take Indiana to the next level. And then he was very disappointed for the state of Indiana because of the work of the last 8 years was some of it was going to be overturned.
Did he campaign much for John Metz? Excuse me.
Yes.
So he put some real effort.
Look. I mean, Dollyne, if I could just, and Mark said earlier, things he said privately, he'll say publicly. I mean, one of the big issues in that, you could say whatever, was the residency case. And Bob Orr's decision was that there'd been a case in South Dakota where they waited until the last minute and it backfired and whatever. So his idea was, we're going to get out front on this and make that an issue. And it was a disagreement. And I'm not saying it was me. I did have a different opinion on that, as I think Mark will remember, and others, and there were other law firms that were represented in that room. But the biggest issue about that was that Bob Orr kind of made that decision and they went along with it. But we gave Evan Bayh the greatest free exposure, I think, that we've ever given anybody. And at the time when you're talking about changes, you're talking about Republicans in control for 24 years. I mean, there were lots of different things, license branches, kind of coming to the front a lot more even then. It was tough. But Bob Orr was deeply affected by it. And Bob Orr felt in the conversations I had with him, and there were many of them, because at that point I was his outside counsel, he was disappointed that he couldn't do more. I mean, he felt as if John Metz was a great partner, and he raised money for John Metz. Every time we did an event, he showed up. I mean, he was engaged, but I think felt a little bit like, I want to do more and I can't.
Mark?
Yeah, it was heartbreaking for Bob Orr that John lost that race. And that, it was just nothing that you could do. It's one of those things that politics has tides, and it was Republicans had controlled the state house or the governor's office at that point for 16 years, and there comes a sentiment among the populace that they just want to change, and I would say that was the difference in the race, is that sort of undercurrent of it's time for a change. And there's nothing you can do about that. And I agree with Bob that Evan was boosted. Shella will have a better commentary on this than any of us, because he watched it and covered it and has a more objective view. But I think the residency case and the argument for our listeners that Evan Bayh was not a resident of Indiana, and at least under the state law, probably helped Evan way more than it hurt him.
Yeah, for what it's worth, state law requires a candidate for governor to live in Indiana for 5 years prior to the election. And there was a technical legal argument to be made there, but essentially the big picture argument was this was an effort to convince people that Senator Birchbuy's son was not a Hoosier, and it backfired.
Let me ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to Jim for a final question before we end the podcast. Leaders and Legends podcast. We're discussing the career of Governor Robert Orr with Bob Grand, Mark Lubbers, Dollyne Sherman, and co-host Jim Shella. One of the things that's come up on the other podcasts I've done about elected officials is sort of like their family tree, their political family tree. And the three of you worked for Governor Orr. You mentioned other folks, John Hammond, who's a friend, Ken Kobe, who's another friend, and the list goes on. And perhaps maybe Bob Orr's greatest accomplishment was launching the career of Tim Oakes. That has to be at the very, very top of the list, of course. But how important was it to the governor to create this political tree of his and see all his aides and department heads and workers and associates prosper? Bob?
Well, I would just simply summarize it this way. Look at his cabinet, look at his appointments, and look at the age of those people. He was committed. He had Judge Ryan, who was always good for the fact that he sat at the end of the table, and all of us would pop off about something, and Judge Ryan would take a drag on a cigarette and say, "We tried that 25 years ago, and it was stupid," and that would be the end of it. But he didn't do that. He didn't do that every time, and he didn't do it. But he was surrounded. Bob Orr surrounded himself. Every appointment, when you look at that transition, go back and look, the people that he replaced, a state board of accounts putting in, Jim, what's his name? And then Jim Gutting. And, guys that were, there were some older people in there, Beasley and others, but there were primarily younger people, all of his staff, Mark was young then, and Dollyne, and folks like that. But really, when you look at it, to me, I've always said he was absolutely committed to doing that. And he also had another trait about him, which he followed through on, and particularly in my case, he had my law school schedule. He wouldn't let me miss class. I mean, his view was, if a bus or if a train and I hit, you got to have a future. And he encouraged people to go to school. He encouraged people to finish school. Some misled him on whether they finished school or not, and we had to straighten that out. But he was adamant about that, and that's what I think was his incredible tree. Not that other governors haven't done it, but that was his tree. And those people today, there's a lot of young people now, not so young, Randy Shepard, another that he brought into this thing. And I think is an amazing testament to his skill and ability to recruit and promote young people.
Mark Lubbers, I was just getting ready to mention Randy Shepard. Is that maybe perhaps Governor Orr's lasting legacy to Indiana, is the brilliant career of Randy Shepard?
It's certainly one of his crowning legacies, and we fought hard to get Justice Shepard named Chief Justice. One of the more interesting battles. I remember locking Channel 13 out of a news conference. The only time I ever did that, and I wasn't even press secretary at the time. I came back from the dead to do that.
Right.
That was after Bob Orr walked out of an interview at Channel 13, correct?
It was. I was there, and we walked out intentionally. It was offensive.
And that
was, yes, to Randy Shepard, I just want to emphasize the point that Bob made. Bob Orr was the oldest governor in America, and he had the youngest staff in America. He loved young people. He loved new ideas. He liked being challenged by young people, and he liked influencing their careers. And I think he took great pride in all of the work that people went on to do. He was a real champion of the future. He cared about the future. He was a man of the future, not the past.
Jim, you got one more question for the group, or you want to?
No. I think we need to. Go ahead, Bob. You first.
I was just gonna say it could be summarized this way. When I graduated from law school, he actually showed up at my swearing-in ceremony. There was a thing there, and I had lost a girlfriend who I dated for a long time, and she actually came back, and I'm now married to her. But the fact of the matter was that Bob Orr said, standing in the Supreme Court, this is a whole identification of what he thought about it. He goes, Grand, he always called me Grand. He said, Grand, I'm willing to bet today that in your legal career, it will mean more to you to have been an administrative assistant to the governor than to have been on law review. And, to that date, I never made law review, but to be on that date, it's really been true. And that summarizes kind of his thought process of the idea that he knew that he was doing something for me that was extraordinary. And I would say to you that there's not many days that go by that you don't reflect on that. And I think that's about his attitude about young people and what he was thinking like that.
Dollyne?
Something else about his character, I've told the story many times, but listeners need to hear it. At one particularly difficult time when lots of us were spending 10, 12, 13 hours a day working, he picked up the phone one day and called my wife. And we had 2 little girls at the time, and he said, Teresa answered the phone and said, well, Mark's not here, Governor. He said, oh, I know. He's down in the office working down the hall. He said, I called to talk to you. He said, I just want you to know that I know you are making a sacrifice by supporting him, by letting him do very long hour days. And he said, I want you to know that I appreciate it. That is stunning for a politician to have that much sense and sensitivity to the entire network of people that are supporting the work that you do. And it's an extraordinary thing and completely in tune with the man he was.
Dollyne?
I'll just add that, he was a consummate gentleman. Many times, countless times, I would come into my office and he would have left a note on my desk thanking me for one thing or the other, leaving me a book with something that he thought I would be interested in reading. Many times at the end of a very long day, and we had very long days when we were out, especially with selling the A+ program during that legislative session, I would get home and he would have left a voicemail message on my answering machine thanking me again. I mean, he was just a wonderful gentleman, in addition to being the wisest man I've ever worked with. And I would just conclude by saying this. I mean, I never in all that time would I have thought that I would have served in the legislature. And my very brief 18-month stint in the legislature, his voice was the voice in my head through every policy discussion, every bill debate. What would Bob Orr do? What would Bob Orr think of this? He's had that kind of profound influence on all of us, really. The role model and the example he set for all of us. And I would just say this, a saying he used to quote, the wise man plants the tree whose shade he will never enjoy. And Bob Orr, as I said, was the wisest of the wise.
Jim Shella, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, I'll just finish with a fun story. I was 1988. I was in New Orleans to cover the Republican National Convention, and we got there a day early. And Bob Orr was already there because he'd been on the GOP platform committee, and so the delegation hotel was mostly empty, with the exception of the Channel 8 crew and Bob Orr. And there was a bar in the hotel. And so I went and knocked on his door and said, Governor, we're not doing anything. You want to go get a beer? And he said, sure. So we went down to the bar and sat at the piano. It was a piano bar. And we sat there and we had a beer or two, had a nice conversation. And at some point, the piano player came in and sat down. And the governor looked at him and said, you're not going to start playing, are you? And the guy said, it's what I'm here for. It's what I get paid to do. And the governor looked at him and said, well, I guess there goes the conversation. That was the end of our evening. So, but he was very straightforward.
Thank you for listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our sponsors are Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery. Our guests have been Bob Grand, Mark Lubbers, Dollyne Sherman, all discussing the career, personality, and impact of Governor Robert Orr. Thank you, Jim Shella, for serving as co-host, and thank you all for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.